Well, between the Mark Norman case and a big jump in employment numbers, lots to discuss with our Friday panel of MPs. I'm joined by Marco Mendicino, the Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure and Communities, Ontario Conservative MP Michael Barrett, and New Democratic Ontario MP Brian Masse, who is the party's critic for economic development. Welcome to all three of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mendicino, let me start with you. And of course, more questions today for the government on its handling of the Mark Norman case. Why was it so important for the government to crack down on Mark Norman when, we're in a city that's full of leakers, and certainly there's an indication that this information could have come from several different avenues?
Well, there shouldn't be leaking, but let me begin by underlining that the decision to investigate, to lay charges, and subsequently to withdraw those charges were all made independently by the RCMP and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. And that was affirmed by both the prosecutor, by Vice Admiral Norman's own lawyer, Marie Henin, as well as the Director of Public Prosecutions. And so the only ones who are really still saying and suggesting that there was any kind of political interference are the Conservatives. And instead of making these completely baseless allegations, they should be taking the statements that have been made by every single player in this trial at face value. And it may be that the only reason why they want to keep talking about Vice Admiral Norman is that they don't want to talk about our exceptional economic growth.
But are we going to get an explanation at all from the government on why, out of the several dozen people who had access to that information about procurement, that it was Vice Admiral Norman who, in the end, was charged?
Well, no, and that's because it's not a government decision to investigate, and who is investigated and who is not investigated. Those decisions are made by our law enforcement agencies, including the RCMP in this case. And it's important that your viewers understand that in order to maintain a high degree of public confidence in our administration of justice, that those decisions are taken separate from the government. Indeed, everybody who was part of this trial confirmed that the government did not have any political interfering role in the matter.
So, Mr. Barrett, let me turn to you now. You've been hearing for 3 days now what the government's been saying. What's your view on where the story stands now and what needs to be heard?
Well, we need to hear the full picture, and certainly in spite of the government's best attempt to interfere in the independence of our judicial system. The Director of Public Prosecutions was an office set up by the Conservative government, and they were able to execute on their function. Unfortunately, the Liberals took every opportunity to drag out this process to smear Vice Admiral Mark Norman. 2 years, this process went on for 2 years. He was summarily suspended from his role as Vice Chief of Defense Staff and from the military. And then another year after, he waited a full year and then was in court for a year. And what we found out this week was the reason that the charges were dismissed is because the documents that they've been waiting on, that the government has been slow rolling to put out, were the ones that, in fact, fully exonerated him. So the political interference comes in the form of the PMO and the PCO not releasing documents in a way that that is honest and transparent and in search of and support of justice and the rule of law.
Mr. Masse, your party's called for a wider inquiry into the Norman case. What are the specific avenues that you think that inquiry would look at, and how would it work?
Well, there's a couple of things here that are important. It's another procurement that should actually be good news for Canadians and good news for our jobs and good news for our economy that's gone off the rail. It seems that we're incapable of buying or purchasing just about anything in this country. And there's no doubt that when you see a change in the sales between the Conservatives and the Liberals, there was almost like a strategy for one PMO office to the other that has a victim being Vice Admiral Norman at the end of the day, being a recipient of all the either be information not being released or intensification of the case file going forward. And then now it's dropped without anything really being provided of sufficient other than they just didn't interview some people. So for us, a full public inquiry is necessary because we don't want somebody else to be dragged through this. And second of all, if it's going to be this way with regards to our military procurement and other procurement for Canadian industries, it's not good business. So it's bad for the Vice Admiral, it's bad for his family, it's bad for the country, it's embarrassing. And then on top of that is, why do you have the PMO's office basically changing course just a bit? I mean, if it's either the red guys or the blue guys, that shouldn't be the case.
So, Mr. Mendicino, let's go back to you because, the questions have still been out there about why the RCMP investigated the way it did, why the Public Prosecution Service did what it did. Now, you're a former federal prosecutor, so let me ask you, because it's been suggested that it was evidence provided by former Conservative cabinet ministers to the defense that may have played a role in what happened here. So why do you think it took the defense team's work to get that information out to the court and ultimately perhaps set in motion what happened?
Well, look, the defense and defense lawyers that represented Vice Admiral Norman had a job to do. When I was a prosecutor, we studied a case called Boucher and the Queen, which says, in short form, it's not about winning or losing, it's about the pursuit of justice. And in order to ensure that there is justice, there needs to be compliance with disclosure obligations. And documents, thousands of documents, were produced to Vice Admiral Norman in the course of this trial. And before disclosing them, in order to ensure that we're protecting national security, in order to ensure that we're protecting solicitor-client privilege, which is a hallmark of our administration of justice, they have to be carefully vetted. So I think it's really important to underline that for your viewers. And really what my friends from the Conservatives are suggesting is that, that Marie Henein and the Director of Public Prosecutions are misleading Canadians by saying that there was no political interference. Well, if that's not the case, then stop saying that we're politically interfering, because you were, sorry, if I could be permitted to finish.
Well, let's let Mr. Mendicino
If I could be
finish.
permitted to finish, then stop saying that this trial was politically interfered with. When Vice Admiral Norman's own lawyer, who was speaking on his behalf, is saying the opposite, then you're suggesting that Marie Henein and the Director of Public Prosecutions are misleading Canadians. You should stop doing that.
Mr. Barrett, so let me put this question to you. How important should it be for government to investigate and potentially prosecute cabinet secrets, confidential information, when it comes to, whether it's naval procurement or another issue?
The rule of law needs to be upheld in Canada. And when we have a government that it takes whistleblowers to come forward and reveal that code words were being used, and that this government exercised, the Liberal government had the foresight in this attempt to politically interfere to use code words so that access to information requests wouldn't reveal their attempts to smear and target Vice Admiral Mark Norman because he was out of step with the wishes of the Prime Minister. And so we see that, and we see the slow disclosure of documents. We see the full redaction of documents. Everything was fully within the control of the Prime Minister's office. And the final release of those documents that exonerated Vice Admiral Norman came only days after a former general and a Liberal member of Parliament says that he was going to testify to support him. So we have substantial evidence. We have substantial evidence that the government not only overplayed its hand, but worked very, very hard to drag Vice Admiral Mark Norman through the mud. And frankly, a lot is owed to him, including a return to his position as Vice Chief of Defence Staff, compensation for what's been done to his family and to his personal reputation. But, the Vice Admiral's lawyer even said that, we need to be concerned when the government's finger is put on the scales of justice. The judge reamed out the government lawyers on more than one occasion for their conduct and their disclosure process. And so to say that everything was above board and that there was a big love-in at the end, I think we must have been watching very different press conferences, Marco, because...
Okay, well, I do want to let Mr. Masse get in here on this.
Well, this is the thing, and all of the mix of all of this is the mere fact that this should have been a good story with regards to building something for our men and women of service. And what's happened is the Liberals and Conservatives have turned this into a play toy and a problem that shouldn't have actually existed. And it wasn't until Andrew Leslie, Liberal Member of Parliament, decided that he was going to testify that this turned on a dime. And that's the reality of what we're facing here right now, is that if we want to fix this for the future, there has to be more shed light at this, and there has to be consequences. Right now, there's no consequences that took place. There's no consequences for the previous administration, the Conservatives, for starting this. There's no consequences for Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet right now with regards to how they've been treated. The only consequences is Mark Norman and his actually family suffering through this time, and it's unacceptable.
Okay, I do want to turn to today's economic news, and that's, of course,
some positive
the fact that 107,000 jobs were reported created last month. Mr. Mendicino, there was certainly an indication from various economic outlooks that there would be robust job growth this year, even as other economic numbers perhaps slowed. So, let me get your reaction on, how the government sees those numbers and what they mean.
Well, we're very encouraged by the fact that StatsCan comes out and says that we've had the single largest jobs growth in a month since we started keeping track of these stats in 1974. And this adds to the 1 million jobs which have been created, the vast majority of which are full-time jobs, good-paying jobs for hard-working Canadians since we've taken office. Compare that to the last Conservative administration, which had the weakest economic growth since the Great Depression. And this is proof that our plan is working. We're investing in infrastructure. We're building transit. We're building roads. We're adding to the rural infrastructure by ensuring that Canadians have access to the internet. We're ensuring that Canadians have protection from the floods and other extreme weather events by adding thousands of water systems. And by extension, we're creating jobs. So we know that this is not a job done yet. And I know, for example, in Alberta, where there has been some concerns around the energy sector, that we need to do more. And we have approved 4 pipelines. And we saw 20,000 jobs created in this in the last month. That's a positive sign that we're turning things around.
So, Mr. Barrett, I guess it begs the question. One of the big arguments that your party is going to put forward this fall is about the Trudeau government's economic management and what Mr. Scheer says he would do better. Does that kind of big number, 107,000 jobs in 1 month, is that going to hurt your argument that you're going to make to Canadians?
Look, another big number that we've heard in the last month is that 50% of Canadians are within $200 of insolvency. It's really tough. It's really tough for Canadians to get ahead. They're not able to save for the future, and they're really struggling. And so we're going to focus on making life more affordable for Canadians, and we don't believe that a tax on everything, the carbon tax, is going to help Canadians get there. It's also going to do nothing to help the environment. You take a look at the investments that this government is not making and their commitments that they're pushing off down the road. Connecting rural communities by 2030 isn't enough in terms of broadband. Infrastructure investments that communities have been starved for. They waited 3 years into their mandate to dump money into the gas tax. Meanwhile, there have been infrastructure projects that have been shovel-ready all the while. And if you take a look across the country to Alberta, we have the TMX pipeline, and no shovels have been in the ground. They said when they bought it that construction would start immediately, and now we're hearing that it's not going to be until June until they take a decision on whether or not it's going to get built. So there's certainly a lot of questions, and we're going to continue to focus and hold this government to account to make sure life's more affordable.
Well, Mr. Masse, let me end with you, because you're the party's economic development critic. You come from southwestern Ontario, where certainly job numbers are always in the news. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to be looked at here. First of all, comparing numbers from 1974, the population was totally different then at that point, and so you have to look at the relevance of the data there. Second of all, you have issues like, say, for example, the automotive industry or value-added manufacturing. Those jobs aren't growing right now. In fact, we've seen General Motors cut, we've seen Ford cut, we've seen Chrysler Fiat cut. And at the same time, just in my neck of the woods, Detroit area has gotten around $12 to $14 billion worth of investment for the new automotive age, where meanwhile, over the last 4 years, this government has only been associated to $6 billion worth of investment in the auto sector, and most of that was actually renewal. So we're at a point here when we're looking at the quality of jobs. Most of the jobs that are being created are actually, they're short, part-time, they're precarious employment, and they don't have the values that are necessary for raising a family. So we need to really focus on the value-added aspect, and that's why Canada, even to the OECD, is lagging when it comes to innovation, investment in value-added jobs, and manufacturing. This industry is growing everywhere else but Canada.
I don't disagree with what Brian says. And in fact, I having been to his part of the country and actually shared a stage with Brian in ensuring that we are providing support to the auto manufacturing sector, including an exemption that would apply to the Pacifica for a third line at the FCA plant in Windsor, is part of the concrete progress which we're showing to support our auto workers. But the big picture here is that our economic performance is continuing to strengthen. We've got 1 million jobs. That's something that we should all celebrate.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thanks so much for your time, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.